All right, thank you everyone for coming. It looks like we have a really amazing group here today, so let's kick it off. This is actually the first in what's going to be a series of educational webinars. They're all going to be about one topic, which is decentralized clinical research. So to give you a little context about our company, some of you know who we are, some of you don't. We're Curebase. We've been running decentralized trials for about 3 years. We built our own software platform that is purpose-built for decentralized research and enables us to bring to life new methodologies, patient-centered techniques, and remote management as both a virtual research site and as a contract research organization. And we've been applying these methodologies on the front line, so we picked up a lot of real-world experience that we're super excited to share with the broader community now. And the first topic in the series is going to be quality and oversight in decentralized trials. I think that this is an area where there's just so much to learn, so what better place to start? To give you a little overview of how these webinars will work, we'll start with the walkthrough of our techniques. Again, these are the techniques that we've applied and been successful with on real studies with thousands of patients, and we'll be sharing how they fit into our unique version of decentralization. After that, we'll pivot into our guest panel. We have some amazing panelists who are living this experience right now. Many have been running decentralized trials for years. Others are adopting decentralized techniques right now. So we'll be able to hear from multiple perspectives, including what it's like to adopt these methods for the first time during COVID-19. So we're going to start by introducing our panel, and they'll be leading the second half of the conversation. First, we have Richard Erwin, who is the Senior Director of Operations at the Dario Lung Cancer Institute. He's done many decentralized studies before, including one right now that is a complex patient-centric biospecimen study. We also have Kai Langel, Director of Clinical Innovation at Janssen, and currently the technology co-lead at Trials at Home, which is developing and piloting standards for remote decentralized trials in Europe. Kai, I'm actually going to let you do a brief self-introduction now.
First ever purpose-built platform for this purpose, not too different from what Curebase is. So very happy to support Curebase here today. And about 3 years ago, I decided to change my environment quite dramatically, and I decided to join a big corporation, so part of Johnson & Johnson and the Janssen Clinical Innovation team, and also the industry side technology lead in Trials at Home, which is an IMI project. So IMI is the Innovative Medicines Initiative. Trials at Home is a large project for 5 years, 40 million of European money, 30 plus partners in there to really build a framework for these kind of trials in Europe. So that's the hat I'll be wearing today in the panel. So thanks for very much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, and lastly, we have Lan Fong. Lan is the founder and principal consultant at Avery Biopharma. She's working with many clients right now across biopharma to help them adapt in the current COVID-19 climate and forge ahead with new remote methods that are being tried out on those studies. So Lan, you can introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. My name is Lan. I've worked in the biotech industry for the last 15 years. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've managed all phases of clinical trials from first-in-human studies to registrational global phase 3 programs, as well as post-FDA approval registry studies. As a consultant, I work with companies of varying sizes, including startups and mid-size or large pharma. Most of my clinical experience has been in drugs and biologics, advancing them through the clinical development pipeline. I've worked on multiple studies in infectious disease, neurology, oncology, and ophthalmology. As we are adapting now to a remote and virtual setting, I'm helping some of my clients adopt some of their some virtual strategies for traditional site initiation, investigator meetings, and monitoring practices.
Thanks, Lan. Okay, so that's the panel. And my name's Tom. I'm the founder and CEO here at Curebase. Okay, so we'll dig into our brief presentation before we pivot into the panel. So I'm going to start by setting a little context about what's happening right now in the broader environment. So I'm sure most folks know, but COVID-19 really has disrupted site-based research in very major ways. Enrollment for anything that is not COVID-19 is very close to stalled. Sites are having tremendous difficulty seeing patients on site, and even if they could, many patients are not feeling safe. So there are concerns there as well from the patient side about wanting to come into the visit. So sponsors are by necessity adapting right now, and they're going to incorporate decentralized elements to make their studies continue to thrive. So for most sponsors, I would say many of the adaptations right now are incremental. You know, there's still the thinking, you know, maybe we won't be able to enroll new patients, or maybe we won't be able to have new baseline visits, but we can, at least for the patients who enrolled, find way to continue doing the assessments, continue doing the safety, and keep these studies going. So to do that, there are a few key tools that are really rapidly being rolled out, and it's really exciting to see. All of these are things that we've done on most of our studies at Curebase as well. The first one is telemedicine. So if something has been done traditionally with a face-to-face conversation with a physician, let's do it over video call if we can. Another one is home visits. So if a study requires a blood draw, a biospecimen collection, let's think also, finger prick, this can be done. We'll send someone to your home to do it rather than you coming on site. And then finally, smart devices, ePro, these are sort of the mainstays of what people think of clinical, decentralized clinical research. So this is what's happening right now, but our opinion at Curebase is it's not quite enough. These tools help retain patients and they help keep studies going in a challenging time. But at Curebase, we've rethought things on a more fundamental level, and we'd like to share what sort of our version of decentralized research looks like and how that relates to quality. So we'll start by picturing sort of the most conventional study design, which is a single site study. In this design, you have one investigator with their staff. They see patients from the local area, and the study procedures are performed mostly on site. So this is super low variability because you have one highly trained staff, and they're all engaging with patients at a single location. So there's really no opportunity for variance. And it's also extremely easy to monitor. You have a single CRA that they visit the location frequently, and you're basically all set there. But of course, this doesn't have the access to patients that most studies need. So that's where we go to a multi-site. In the multi-site, you have many sites, and there's higher variability because you have more investigators who are more broadly distributed and more distance between them. And it's quite expensive to monitor. You need many CRAs who are traveling and visiting on site to keep that multi-site going with sites adhering to GCP into the protocol. So decentralized trials have the risk of being sort of the extreme version of that, of having the least interaction and oversight of patients by investigators, the broadest variability as study activities move to the home and are done by patients, and also the most challenging monitoring plans because there might not even be a physical site to monitor. So if we're going to be successful in decentralized world, we have to really do some new thinking about what the site and decentralization means. So at Curebase, our vision of decentralization is not according to that diagram. We have a different view, which is that it's a little bit of counterintuitive, but with technology, decentralized trials can actually be very centralized. So I'll let people think about that for a moment, what that means. It's a bit counterintuitive, but basically, I'll explain it. Decentralized trials are decentralized with respect to where the data is collected. So there are thousands of patients miles apart reporting their outcomes, tracking their steps, doing their finger pricks from home. But the oversight with the help of telemedicine can actually be structured and performed by a single virtual site. The only difference is that it's a virtual site. So we do this and have structured this at Curebase. We have PIs, sub-investigators, virtual research coordinators. They have SOPs, delegation log, engage with the IRB, but they don't have a building and they engage with patients using new modalities. So text, phone, video, and most importantly, sort of a comprehensive view of the data for those patients enabled by the right software platform so that this virtual site can feel like they're on the ground with patients thousands of miles apart. So that doesn't mean that we don't work with sites. I mean, on the contrary, we love working with sites. They have great relationship with patients and can drive really diverse, high quality recruitment. And needless to say, also, most studies have activities that simply must be done in a physical location. So to name a few, let's think of MRIs, let's think of infusions, physical exams, and I could easily go on here. So here's where I think a lot of sponsors see limitations in decentralized research. They think, decentralization is not the answer. Maybe it's not a good fit for what the needs of our study are. But at Curebase, we actually see opportunity, and our view of decentralized research is much bigger than at home. In our trials, we expand where clinical trials are executed to include community providers, local PCPs, urgent care clinics, imaging centers, community hospitals, the sort of touch points for patients organically with the healthcare system. And in the COVID-19 crisis, if implemented correctly, engaging these new categories of providers, including mobile providers, it generally has the potential to keep highly complex studies enrolling and thriving. So logistically, we do this in a way that's a bit unique. Depending on the provider type and the type of study, we'll control their scope and we'll bring them on as satellite sites with high fidelity remote oversight by the central site I was telling you about. They're on the delegation log, but they don't need to do everything. And a surprising set of responsibilities can actually be taken off of these satellite sites plate and moved onto a virtual central site that's highly trained in engaging with patients remotely, using telemedicine and using decentralized tools. So remote consent is a great example of this. I'm going to give you sort of a bit of a scenario, but let's say we're pivoting a study to include home blood draws or new forms of data capture. All those patients will need to be reconsented, and that will be best served by a remote consenting process. So the right answer here varies from study to study, but if you're using the central virtual site model, we can actually have a single dedicated free consenting team that is notified when this type of activity is required. This is what we do with our virtual research coordinators at Curebase, and it's worked really, really well. We train our staff, we know them personally, and they develop a really significant expertise in the remote management of the study, the remote patient engagement. This would be a way of taking that off of some of the local providers' plates and having the highly trained central team engage in that remote process. We can also go into an oversight scenario. So let's imagine a study is utilizing local PCPs as a recruitment channel. And we ask them, these local PCPs, to perform a medication review as part of an eligibility assessment. So we're sourcing patients in a new community setting, which is amazing, but there is some quality risk here because we're broadening where the study activities are being performed. So what you can do is set up an escalation workflow to create the oversight. So in this workflow, the local PCP flags the patient as eligible. They put in certain data like medication history, et cetera, but then the central PI at the virtual site is notified. So this PI who's trained, they're looking at the data and they can see certain things that would reveal perhaps if a decision was made in error. For example, if a class of medication was actually taken by the patient, that would be exclusionary. So with this workflow, when a critical, perhaps risky event takes place, it's elevated to the central site. They're able to review the data in real time and sort of provide a verification on that. There's documentation of that, and they can actually reverse the decision if needed. So these types of workflows I'm showing you, the remote virtual consent by central team, the PI escalation, they're going to be extremely difficult unless an incredible amount of data is made available to the PI and the virtual staff at their fingertips. I mean, there's so much that a PI and their staff have to do. By GCP, they're accountable for the well-being of the patient, the oversight of the study, and in a decentralized study, these patients could be very far away. So they have to make decisions like, are eligibility assessments correct? Are procedures being done according to protocol? Are patients reporting all of their adverse events? If they're going to do this, they need to have data that they can use and understand, and it's very, very complicated and decentralized. So I've listed out a few types of data that are common, but we have data from providers. We have data from the home health providers now. We have data from labs, which might actually be offsite in a decentralized study. We have paid data from patients who are self-reporting, EMRs, and smart devices. So putting all this together is an upfront investment that is absolutely essential if you're going to be doing decentralized research at high quality, and it's something that we make a prerequisite and enable through our platform. So I can provide an example of sort of where things start to struggle if this is not done. This is a very common example now that we're in the COVID-19 era, but let's picture a mobile phlebotomy study visit, let's say to measure cholesterol. So the home visit provider might be sort of a vendor. It could be a national vendor with many, many different teammates in many, many different states. So it's going to be difficult to entirely rely on just training to make sure that they do exactly what the protocol requires. There are certain errors that will perhaps arise and we should be mindful of. There's, for one, did the patient fast? Super important when you're doing blood-based labs. And two, did the blood draw occur at the right time of day? It's going to make a big difference when you go to analyze that data. So beyond training, the data-driven solution here from the Curebase perspective is to unify the ePro and the mobile provider workflow, to bring it together in a digital platform. So the remote PI can have access now to a full picture of what's going on the ground. It's really important to get the full picture of this home visit up so that the remote PI can actually perform their responsibilities and ensure that the oversight is taking place. So we can start by saying, let's have the patient report their diet the day before. We can have them actually input what they ate. And if you're even more worried about this and you want to go the extra mile, you could habituate the patient through, let's say, frequent questions regarding their diet over time so that you can ensure that they're a high quality participant from this perspective. We can also double down and give a workflow to the mobile provider. We can ask them during the visit to actually do it accompanied by a guided workflow, which will involve asking the patient again, what did you eat? And it will also time box this. So we can say that maybe the patient has to submit their data between 6 and 12 p.m. around the diet, and the provider, the mobile provider, has to submit their information regarding the visit in a specific time window in the morning. So when this is all said and done, we have a tightly controlled workflow, and we kind of have the best of both worlds. The PI is able to provide remote oversight with a complete picture of what happened on the ground, and we're able to reach patients at home. So if you want to take this even further, I mean, this is just the data that's submitted by the actors in the trial. There's actually something that I don't think most sponsors consider, and this has to do with pulling EMR data. You can actually arm the PI with real world data by pulling it from EMRs and compiling a medical history of the patient's real world medical data. This is probably not what people are thinking about usually when they think of source data, so stay with me and I'll explain it. The actual mechanism is that patients have a right to access their medical records. With the proper consenting workflow, you can actually have patients authorize that their records be collected and used for research from anywhere the patient was recently treated, hospitals, different clinical settings, and pull that together. So you can have a PI request the records, and then through the virtual team, we can actually have them get on the phone, reach out to those hospitals, those different clinical settings, and request the records to be pulled in to a data set that can then be made available to the PI. And the quality implications here are really, really huge. There's just so much you can do. You can use it to help confirm eligibility. You can use it for endpoint collection. You can use it to help know if the patient was hospitalized. And with the right tooling, and this is something we do in Curebase, you can actually automate aspects of this. So for example, in the hospitalization situation, if you want to be periodically checking if that occurs, you can set up workflows to do that as well. So pulling in real world data, adding that to the toolkit that's available in real time to the PI, and letting them feel like they're on the ground even more to do their job when patients are so far apart. So that covers most of the data scenarios, but it's not all about data. I think, making sure the data is high quality, feeling like you're on the ground is one thing, but another big thing in decentralized trials is patient engagement. So, you have patients, in site-based studies, it's really straightforward because the patient is physically present, but in remote studies, you have to think about this very proactively. So an interesting recent example from Curebase comes from a study that included a self-report assessment. One patient was reporting an extreme value consistently for about 2 weeks in a row on a self-report outcome survey, and they were doing this electronic through our ePro. So, extreme value might be indicative of a safety or perhaps poor engagement problem, but we had set up a trigger for this. So we're able to actually notice that this activity is occurring and flag it so the PI is notified. They can now review the case, and they're armed with all of that data that we were talking about before, the data from the different sources pulled together, and they can start to look at this on their plate and say, do I need to make a decision here? And armed with that data, they actually decide, let's get on the phone and let's talk to this patient. Let's ask them, is something wrong? Have you been to the hospital recently? You can inquire and start to see if there's a safety problem, and you can start to see if the patient needs to be re-engaged, re-explain to them, what their expectations are in the study, what the purpose of the ePro is, et cetera. And in this event, we actually found one, that, there was no safety concern, and two, we re-engaged the patient and saw an uptick in their participation and their high quality contribution of data. So the proactive outreach there and the triggers armed with the data are super important. Going even further on the safety, I think you really need to think about this because, again, on-site study, more conventional study, the adverse event flagging takes place during the visits. Most study visits will have a case report or an adverse event review that takes place when the patient comes in, but in decentralized study, that might not happen. And patients are not always picking up the phone and calling and saying, I'm having this sort of event, or I'm not feeling well. So you got to set a schedule. You can pick a schedule that's maybe 4 weeks, maybe it's 2 weeks, whatever it is. If you have a platform, a software platform that's capable of doing this, you can automate it. But proactively reach out to the patient, ask them if something is wrong, and if it is, then you have to follow up. And this is actually non-trivial. So we're proactively reaching out, we're getting the patients to report their events. But what do you do next? I mean, once a problem is identified, that's just the start of the challenge. The patient is not on site, so how do you dig into the details and actually flesh out this adverse event report? So this, again, we're tying the data sets together, and using EMR data becomes really, really important. If the patient has authorized health records to be accessed, like we talked about before, the proper workflows are in place, you can actually follow up and get the hospitalization records. So we're starting to flesh out the report with hard real-world data. And you can also have a virtual coordinator from the central team reach out to the patient and start to fill out details that are missing from that pulled data. So ask them specific questions. Were you taking drugs? Did you change your drug schedule? Whatever it is, they can actually get on the phone with the patient, fill out that report remotely. And from that point, it goes to the central PI. So we have the central PI now reviewing something that includes data from the hospitalization, data from a conversation with a virtual coordinator, and it's all being done by a staff that is highly trained in these remote elements. They know how to do this. You can really delegate this type of activity to them. And the end result is a really high quality SAE report and a determination of whether or not it should go to the IRB, to PV, and so on and so forth. So we've gone through a pretty broad overview of our decentralized platform and how our vision of what monitoring and oversight looks like in a decentralized study. I think most of these workflows can be adopted by sponsors, but it's going to be challenging without a unified platform. So I encourage everybody to think about this and try many of these techniques. But our company has built a software platform that is tailored for this model. We do think that it's really essential to have that. And our platform includes everything from ePro to eConsent, to EDC, eMonitoring. And we also operate as a virtual site and CRO, just really dedicated to making this version of decentralized research and all those quality and oversight controls a reality. So that's Curebase. That's our take on it. But we want to hear from everybody else as well. So we're going to pivot into the panel portion of this conversation now and hear what everybody's different perspectives are on some of these same problems. Okay. So the first question is going to go to Kai. So, right now there's a lot of obstacles, and we just want to know, what are the biggest obstacles helping the industry to further decentralize and meet the needs of clinical studies right now, in your view?
Yeah, very good question. So I think there are many challenges, and I think maybe the biggest one is the sort of internal change management, because all companies, especially the big ones, they have a lot of existing legacy in place in terms of SOPs, and especially in systems, because what you're proposing with a platform like yours is sort of all-in-one holistic platform. That means that we would have to replace multiple platforms that we already own, that we have already invested in, that we have already integrated into our way of operating. That's a big proposal to make. And that's a big part of the challenge. The other challenge, I would say, is that even having the kind of vision that you have is a bit hard to achieve. And this is where I think initiatives like the Trials at Home one come into play, because with Trials at Home, we have nothing in place. We can start with a fresh vision and then demonstrate the results of that vision by implementing the sort of pilot that we want to run in Europe, for example. So hopefully with those results and with the effort that you are also doing, we can show the value of moving to something that is more unified, where these data streams can really be connected in a much more real-time fashion. But that will then also result in us having to operate in a very different way than what we're used to. And these big companies are not so easy to change their ways. So I think that is a big one. Now we have the COVID situation, of course, that have kind of given us the burning platform that has kind of reprioritized the need to be able to execute trials in a bit of a different way. But there is still a lot of work ahead to do this. But if I would start a new pharma company today, it would be very clear to me what kind of infrastructure I would put in place. But you are basically facing decades of legacy SOPs, systems, the way people work, and that doesn't change overnight. So I think that is going to be one of the challenges that needs to be overcome.
Lan, Richard, have you had challenges with change management and sort of the nuts and bolts of making these changes on studies that are ongoing with existing infrastructure?
You want to go first, Lan?
Sure. Sure. I think that with the COVID situation, it happened so quickly, and everyone is adapting pretty fast and on the fly to the current situation. So one of the biggest issues that I've seen is there's the lack of a business continuity plan in planning for these events like this pandemic. So I think everyone from sponsor companies to IRBs to sites and vendors weren't equipped to maintain business continuity in the face of the pandemic. So it's just been a slow adaptation to getting the right procedures in place. And for a while, when we first went into shelter in place, for example, we didn't know how long it was going to last. So it was a matter of, do we just put everything on pause and wait for this to be over? I think after a few weeks in, we quickly realized that it's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. So we really do have to change our processes. We have to alter our monitoring plans. We have to shift our thinking into not how do we just get through this situation, but how do we move forward indefinitely in this new scenario.
I would only add that I agree that COVID has become an accelerant to trends that were already, by slow osmosis, we were already heading in this direction. And this has just forced us to move at warp speed. And I think it's a game changer. My institute is rather nimble and lean, so we didn't have a lot of the legacy issues, but I can just imagine, what those could be in a large organization.
Great. Speaking more about your organization, Richard, I know you're working right now on a decentralized biospecimen study with the Lung Cancer Institute. So we'd love it if you could just share a little bit about what that is, what the decentralized methods are, and how that works on a practical level.
Sure. Very quickly, the Institute has been running trials like this for about 10 years now. So this is not something we had to pivot to. This is something that we've kind of always been doing. We've been doing remote consenting, at-home phlebotomy, at-home clinic visits. We've had actually a remote, as you were describing, Tom, we have a very strong decentralized remote study team who oversees our remote trials on behalf of our network investigators. And I think that's also a key, and I'll just mention two things. While the technology can be very facilitative for sure, and create the mechanisms to do decentralized trials with haste and with quality. I think a lot of the I think what we have to remember is that, especially today in COVID, there's a lot of fear out there. There's a fear of having people come to the home. There's a fear of going to the home. We've all experienced this. We've all been sheltering, so we know what it's like to be trying to do something in isolation. The other side of the coin of fear is trust and confidence. And so having that touch point that you were speaking about, that personalized patient interaction with a team member that provides kind of an empathetic contact and a continuity over the course of a trial is extremely important. Not just from a consenting perspective, which is an iterative process, not a one-off, but from ensuring, as you were saying, you can have all the wearables, you can have all the technology you want, but I think you do need to inspire the trust and confidence of research participants, since more and more now is being asked of them and from them in a decentralized setting.
Great. Anything to add to that, Lan or Kai? Oh, Kai, you're on mute.
Yeah, good call. So I'm involved in some remote studies right now as well. One of them is with the university. Every single other study in the university is paused except our remote study. So that kind of shows the value of this. And also the change management challenge also extends to the environment itself, to HCPs, investigators, and so on. I remember an earlier study where the PI of the study had lots of doubts before the study started about their oversight capabilities and things like that. But then at the end of the study, she was completely convinced that this is the absolute right way of running these trials, because she had all of the data, like you said, in her fingertips. She was able to follow the communication. She was able to get involved when she needed to, and she had a system that told her when her attention was needed. So she was extremely happy with that without ever actually physically seeing any of the patients. So yeah, maybe those two things are worth adding here.
Great. Okay.
I also have a comment on protocol development. So for sponsor companies that are in the midst of current protocol development or perhaps going through a protocol amendment, I would just stress the importance of looking at the study visit windows and really assessing whether those visit windows make sense. I think Richard had mentioned that everyone is afraid of going into the hospital for visits or having someone come into the home. So perhaps before you had every 2-week or every 4-week visits, really looking at those visit windows and seeing if you can adjust those, or maybe a plus or minus to build some flexibility into your protocol. And then also looking at the endpoints too, thinking that you're going to operate this trial in a remote, virtual, or decentralized setting. What are the endpoints that can be assessed remotely, and how often do you need those to be assessed? So really just taking a careful look at the endpoints and the protocol procedures and screening everything just from beginning to end, how to most efficiently operate this trial remotely.
So Richard, on the biospecimen study, I mean, have there been issues with the windowing, so the timing in which the home visits can take place, and have there been any other significant challenges with the biospecimen home visits?
I think Lan said it very well, and I'm helping with in this regard too. We take protocols that have over time become fairly standardized across the industry. And typically it starts with the statistical hypothesis, and then eventually you get to the schedule of events. And I like Lan's comments in the era of COVID and in the era of decentralized methods, working backwards again to make sure that your measures and your time points and are still satisfying what you set out as your original objectives and endpoints. You'd be surprised how many times there is a disconnect. And then when you throw in the shifting landscape of COVID and the requirement to pivot to a decentralized method where you now have to ask yourself a lot of questions that start with the word how, you'll find, as Lan was just saying, that if you haven't amended the protocol, you soon will be. And I would point out that the recent FDA guidance also allows you to modify your database to capture in the case report form things that have been missed because of COVID, so that you can differentiate on your protocol deviations between what are truly missed things and what are missed because of the pandemic. They're making that provision.
So there's a actual category for the COVID-related deviations. I think this goes into a question I've actually wanted to bring up, which is yeah. So I mean, with respect to recent FDA guidance, I think there's a lot of excitement around how they're talking about what new capabilities are possible. Also, references to how deviations are managed. Embracing virtual assessment, et cetera. So I guess I'll ask here. I mean, and it's okay. There's different levels of confidence in the answer, but to what extent is this sort of a blanket approval of these decentralized methods, and to what extent do we still need to be thinking about different regulatory uncertainties and gaining further clarity? I guess Kai, maybe it makes sense for you to start.
Yeah, I can start. So no, this is not the new normal. So we are still dealing with an emergency situation. We have emergency guidance in place to help us get through this and so on. Don't assume that will be the new normal. Mm-hmm. However, I do think that it is maybe a sweeping change in terms of the mindset, because now this is a massive global experiment to see how all of this will work out. And once the dust settles, I'm convinced that this will be analyzed and a lot of good will remain in place. And at the very least, the environment, so regulators, providers, participants, the industry itself has been able to experiment and actually get hands-on experience with all of this new stuff. So I think that will start a new conversation of what should remain, how these tools should be utilized in the future, and to make our trial portfolios, R&D portfolios more proof for these kind of things to happen in the future, because this time around everybody was kind of caught with their pants down, and I'm pretty sure that we don't want that to happen again in the future. So we'll be more prepared, and hopefully some of this guidance that needs to be put in place will help us do that. But I wouldn't take the current situation as an indication of the new normal. I would wait for things to be over and then see what the landscape looks like at that point.
And that goes nicely into what you mentioned, Lan, with the business continuity. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and what your recommendations are there?
I think in regards to the FDA guidance, I would agree with Kai. It's not a sweeping regulatory acceptance of virtual trials, but that it does accelerate the change into telemedicine and virtual visits and conducting telephone visits. And a lot of the previously on-site visits that monitors would conduct or sponsors would conduct, can be done remotely and virtually, and it can be done just as well as me or anyone going there in person. So I think it does accelerate that a lot. The guidance does list specific things that the sponsor or the CRO have to do in terms of training and making sure their electronic systems are CFR Part 11 compliant, that they should develop SOPs for conducting that telemedicine visit. So all these things, I think those will stay. But as Kai said, we do need to wait for additional guidance on conducting remote-based trials.
Got it. I think that makes a lot of sense. And telemedicine has been very rapidly adopted. I think the home visits have also been very rapidly accelerated. And Richard, I actually wanted to ask you about the training there. So I think we're all moving forward out of necessity, but I think there are still open questions in many folks' minds. When we work with vendors, what is their relationship to the general oversight of the trial? Where do they fit in relationship to the site, and how do we ensure they're trained and doing their job appropriately? So I'm sure this is something where you have a lot of experience, and love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the sponsor obligation has changed or has gone away. Just a thought on the conversation we just had. I could be wrong, but I think healthcare entities pivoted to decentralized methods and telemedicine. And it wasn't because of anything that our industry was implementing on our clinical research programs. I think the pandemic brought a necessity to them to continue their care of their patients in this new setting. And, I'm surprised that, when I talk to investigators, sometimes I approach them with open eyes and open ears. How are you doing your practice now in this new setting? And, yes, we like to impose uniform standards across multi-center trials, and, we're accustomed to that. But I think it's worth having, going into a new project and into a new center, just asking them how they would do it or how they are doing it, because this pandemic forced them into it. With respect to the specific question about ensuring staff are competent, yeah, I don't know if the pandemic, or if in the case of decentralized paradigms, there's really a new way of doing that. If there is, please, somebody tell me. I defer to my other esteemed panelists on this one. Okay. I do it the old-fashioned way, reference check and talk, and we can deploy a number of new technologies that have been available for a few years now. I've mentioned before, we be sensitive to dashboards and to monitoring metrics and to learning to react quickly to what might be early trends. But with respect to, the big thing we've encountered in the pandemic with on-site phlebotomy is, as I mentioned, this need to have more trust and confidence established ahead of time between the phlebotomist and the patient. Both come into this leery, and so there are specific mechanisms that have to be done. Some of it's paperwork, some of it's device platforms. Both of them have to feel good about an interaction and a blood draw, and that can be accomplished using both people and tools.
So one other comment, Tom, is around monitoring practices. I think in the last few years, there's been a steady shift from 100% SDV to targeted SDV. And a lot of the data from companies like Metadata, for example, show that 100% SDV actually doesn't change much of the data in your database. You don't end up discovering much more with 100% SDV. So I think when sponsors are creating your trial monitoring plan, thinking about the targeted visits or data points that you really want to do that 100% source data verification on, and not just every single data point. The FDA guidance also did talk about remote or risk-based monitoring. So I think that's there's a lot of sponsors that are resistant to moving into a risk-based monitoring approach, because I think we just have this need to want to verify every source information. So, but I do think that that is the way of the future. We do need to have risk-based monitoring instead of 100% SVP.
Yeah, remote monitoring and risk-based monitoring certainly have been getting a lot of adoption and regulatory acceptance long before this pandemic. I think one thing you'd mentioned to me that is, I think, very new is remote site initiation visit and remote investigator meeting. I think these are happening more frequently now, and they certainly are very innovative. I'd love to know how those have been going for you, and if you have any recommendations regarding those forms of monitoring, the site initiation, and as a great example.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of that depends. The ability of the site to conduct a remote site initiation visit just depends on their IT infrastructure and how tech equipped they are. But the kind of remote SIVs that I've done are essentially you call them and they walk you through the whole site, and you spend like 4 or 5 hours for a typical SIV on the phone with them on a video call. And they're walking you through their clinic or space where they screen patients, do the patient intake, do all the screening procedures. So you can still see everything, So you need the IT capability to be able to do that. We've also been able to, and instead of doing like one day on-site visit, it's 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours. It's just a long time to be on a video call. That gets very mundane. So we've also broken it up, into a couple of calls. Like, let's schedule a call and you can walk me through your clinic, and let's take a look at the pharmacy area and your IP monitoring storage conditions. And then another day we can take a look at the laboratory or the specimen collection area. So, we can break it up into multiple time slots instead of trying to fit it all into a traditional one-day on-site visit. I think what's hard, though, is picturing the patient flow. That's at least been hard for me because I like to see how patients are going to flow through the clinic and how they're going to be enrolled. And obviously, the type of trial is going to vary. But as I mentioned, I work primarily in drug trials and biologics. So there's a lot of infusions, or it's not complicated. It's quite complicated. So it's a little bit hard for me to visualize how and where they're enrolling the patient. And of course, right now, with a lot of hospitals being impacted by COVID, you don't see them at their normal operating capacity. There's dedicated areas for COVID, there's social distancing. And so when there's a huge influx of patients, then there obviously will be more protocol deviations. So I think that's just something to be aware of and continue to interact and engage with the site on.
So Kai has raised his hand, although he's actually doesn't have to raise his hand as a panelist, but I'm sure he has some thoughts.
Yeah, I do, and try to get your attention with that. So I have a couple of concerns about this and also a couple of potential solutions. So first of all, the investigators' meetings are often not really so much about the training, but engagement with the sponsor and also with your other peer investigators. So you get to have dinner with other investigators, you get to talk about the study, and that is a fantastic sort of bonding engagement, get these investigators more involved in the research. And that is an important part, that if we don't have a physical investigators meeting, we should somehow try to replace that with something that could be digitized. So one solution for that could be some sort of a digital community that could be available before the study starts, where there would be rich content, interactions, a discussion forum between the sites, between the sites and the sponsor, and also between the sites themselves. So they could see like who are the other people involved in the study. They could see their profile, a bit like a Facebook-like or LinkedIn-like environment. You can see, oh, this doctor from that side is also involved. Oh, that's great to see. Let me reach out with a chat and things like that. So that could be one solution for the sort of engagement, to make sure that we engage them in a different way. With site initiation visits, this is also about kind of building a relationship between the monitors, the sponsor, and that particular site, and of course understanding how that site works. In terms of like understanding what happens at the site, how it's all set up, the infrastructure and all of that, one thing that would work here quite well is the use of smart glasses. It might sound a bit sci-fi, but it actually is quite practical, because these devices are quite affordable. They could be shipped to the site in advance, and then you could see through the glasses like whatever the person at the site is seeing. So you could then ask them, hey, why don't you show me how you process the blood samples at your site? And they would actually show you how they're doing it, and you would be able to observe them and see what they see. So that might maybe help with sort of some of the visual aspects to really understand how they do or what is their workflow. And the added benefit of that is that all of this stuff could be recorded through the smart glasses, and you would have a record of that. You would go, back to that. If you ever have to, that could be shared with other people as well, and so on. So some of these solutions like bring new opportunities as well, but it needs to be really well thought out, because we don't want to lose that engagement and all of that. If nobody ever sees anybody or talks to anybody, then then I think we are missing out on opportunity to make them really motivated.
I definitely agree with that, Kai. For investigator meetings, I do think that the primary purpose is for engagement and community building between the investigators and the sponsor and the vendors as well. I've noticed that in virtual investigator meetings, there's I think with any Zoom or WebEx session, people get disengaged. So they're not always actively participating in the training sessions. And a lot of the training sessions during investigator meetings can be done not during the actual investigator meeting. They can be put on pre-recorded sessions and just put on an on-demand training platform. But the purpose of the investigator meeting is to actually build that camaraderie between the different sites and investigators. So having some kind of channel where investigators can communicate with each other, that is important.
I wanted to cast a vote of confidence about central and risk-based monitoring. And Tom, I know that your services and your platforms support this well. I oversaw with a large team of people, but a late-stage program, global. And we deployed central and risk-based monitoring techniques on registration, on their registration trials. And this was the company's first filing a BLA and was approved. It's not so much the methods you choose, but how well you perform them and conduct them, and the quality outcomes that are yielded from that are more important. But anyways, it can be done.
Where do we get our smart glasses? Okay, awesome. So where does safety fit into this? So I think that, when you read the FDA guidance right now, safety is, the first in every section. It's, it certainly comes before the efficacy assessments and things of that nature. So are there legitimate safety risks right now as sponsors start to adopt more decentralized methods? And how should we be thinking about that, Kai?
Well, I think it's a pretty simple answer to begin with. Safety must be built in. I think there's three things that, are just, things that you must have before you even start. So safety, maybe the first one. Second, you can't, break any laws, regulations, rules like that. And third, the scientific rigor of the research needs to be maintained. So it doesn't matter if you run the most efficient study in the world, if it doesn't deliver the data that you need, or your patients are not safe. So those three things are the starting point for doing anything. So it doesn't have to be more difficult. It can be different. But I would think that in most cases, actually, it could be easier, because with these connected data streams, you have much more information at your fingertips. You, instead of like seeing the patients every few months when they come to the study visits, you actually have this more continuous engagement with them. You have more data, ideally available from them in more real time. So you don't have to wait until you see them to realize that, well, a month ago there was some sort of an issue. So these remote data capture methods, being able to connect more frequently over telemedicine, giving the participants the ability also to reach out for assistance when they need it. I think these are all mechanisms that really improve safety. But before I would start any kind of engagement, that's the first thing I would think about. Is this the right study? Can I maintain safety in this particular study? before I would think of any kind of decentralization techniques to be applied. So that's kind of a given as a starting point for any of these.
I think that actually sort of dovetails into something you mentioned earlier, which is that currently I forget which institute you mentioned, but one trial is operating and all the others are paused. Do you feel that there are opportunities to expand the scope of what can be decentralized to sort of apply these methods to studies that have perhaps more complexities or broaden, what counts as part of the solvable by these techniques? Because you mentioned that, we should pick which studies are safe to do in this method. I'd love to know where we can expand opportunities.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about like the case that is not paused right now. So that one, for example, is about doing remote cognitive assessments. And traditionally, that has been something that's always been done in person. So you come to the assessor who is trained to use these questionnaires and surveys and do a little test with you. So we've digitized that. And not only can we do the tests remotely, but actually the digitized tests perform better than the classical tests that they're based on.
Wow.
So from the tests, you would actually get like a score, like one of the tests, as an example, you have 1 minute to name as many animals as you can. And the score you get is the number of animals you name correctly. It doesn't take into account like repetitions, things that are not animals. And what we do is we extract extra features from these tests. We actually measure what kind of clusters, semantic clusters you build. The way people typically would do this test is they would go into like cat, dog, mouse, rat, like household animals, and then they would run out of animals, and they would start mumbling like, "Oh my God, I can't think of any other animal anymore." And then they would switch, okay, lion, an elephant, a giraffe, and they would switch to a different category. And these cluster sizes and the time it takes them to switch, these are all things that we can now digitally measure with high precision, and these are extra features that will actually make the test perform better. So the research we're doing, the interim results demonstrate that the tests perform 20% better in this kind of way compared to doing this in person with the clinician recording this on a piece of paper. So not only can we keep the study running, but we're actually getting more precise results as an outcome. So not sure if that fully answers your question, but it's an interesting example anyway.
Where Richard and Lan, where do you sort of see the boundaries of what can be what can be done high quality and decentralized, and what can't, and other opportunities to move that?
I was just going to make a comment on. I think maintaining patient safety in a decentralized setting is more challenging and equally important. We have lots of tools and techniques to detect potential safety signals. The question becomes, what are the triggers, what are the thresholds, and what is the response? Imagine a patient wearing the equivalent of a Google smartwatch, and it's continuously monitoring that person's respiratory rate and oxygen saturation and heart rate, blah, blah, blah. Who's looking at that dashboard, and who's making a decision about whether there's a trend or something of worry here, and what's to be done about it? These are the kinds of discussions that sponsors have to have, and found that by perhaps a COVID patient who's suffering from delirium and is on your study. So it's tricky. I have to admit.
So how did you identify that patient? How did you have that come to your attention? I mean, what are the practicalities there?
What I'm saying is that I think our protocols are moving in, are going to have some new sections that they never had before as we move forward. Yeah, that's my assumption.
I think there's also differentiation between safety assessments and efficacy assessments. And I think the FDA guidance also touches on this point. For any safety assessments that sponsors are able to use alternative sites, for example, laboratory tests or imaging assessments that are all focused on the safety of the trial participant. Versus if it's an efficacy endpoint, then that's when they need to consult with the relevant FDA review division. So I think a lot of these safety endpoints can be moved away from like either the central lab. They could go to a local lab to get that blood draw. We just have to work out the operations and the workflows to make sure they have access to those laboratories.
So you think the efficacy actually requires more regulatory review than
Oh,
safety?
definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
100%. Yeah.
So you mentioned use of local labs, and we're pretty close to time here. But I did want to ask, what do you think is the role of utilizing new types of providers? Because obviously certain portions of the healthcare system are very stalled right now. Research, institutions, particularly because they're doing so much COVID work, are very restricted. But people are still, interacting with the healthcare system in many ways. And what is the role of introducing new types of providers into decentralized research, and where are the opportunities?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, I think that's the next frontier of this decentralization. So it's a great question. Happy to give you my answer. So I think you also already kind of answered it yourself partially. So I really like these guided workflows that you've mentioned. I think we really have to simplify this work for these providers. We need to make it easy for participants to find those services, and especially in the US, you have big retail chains, you have big pharmacy chains, you have all these lab service centers that are networked nationwide in the US. So for you, I think it's easier to tap into those kind of environments. In Europe, that becomes more challenging because we don't have like European-wide networks of pharmacies or any kind of retail chains, basically, where you could kind of plug into a network very easily. So in the US, you can do that more easily, but the workflows and the work that these people have to do needs to be really simplified. So I think a system can really help with that. A system can help with the training. A system can help with the data connectivity. So anything that these resources do, I think needs to be made visible to the investigator, so they can maintain the oversight and all of that. I think it's all issues that can be solved, and I think that's the next frontier of innovation in this particular domain. So very happy to see companies like you tackling these challenges, and looking forward to see what results you get from the field.
I agree, Tom. It's on you now. I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to thank my fellow panelists. I have to excuse myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
I enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you, everybody who was able to join. Sorry we didn't have time for an audience Q&A, but we did our best. So thank you, Kai. Thank you, Lan. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everybody who was able to attend. And if you want to watch this again, the video will be going online on our website shortly. You can also share it with your colleagues. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye then.
Okay.
Bye.